Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Jeff and Tally, and we have a whole new series here, which is Riptide Fundamentals. It will be paired with a Ranger series here later, but this is meant to be an evergreen type series that builds you from the ground up, assuming that you have no prior experience on Riptide other than playing against him or playing him in limited. So first thing we'll talk about is Riptide's first ability, which is when you play a card from hand, you may put a card from your hand face down into your arsenal. Any card you play triggers this. That includes traps and instants. It is not reload, so it still does work with New Horizons, which is when you have a card face up, you have a second arsenal zone. This ability allows you to have 2 card 7 plays, which Rangers traditionally don't really have without having extra draw or tunic. So it allows you to play Lace with Frailty and Endless Arrows to have a 7 with on hits. While traditionally you would have to have tunic to be able to put the arrow in and then buff it, or to pitch it and get 5 off of, say, Dreadbore.
So the second ability, this will be whenever a trap you control triggers, deal 1 damage to the attacking hero. So specifically, the way that a trap would trigger is if it meets the requirements that are based on the trap itself. Just a thing to point out is the crew traps will always trigger. That's why they have to be played from Arsenal, because they have powerful effects that always enable. So they will always deal that 1 damage. And then other traps like Tar Pit Trap, for example, when this defends an attack will go again. The next attack action card that hits this turn, the effect doesn't trigger, so it has to block a card that has go again. I also want to point out too a little interaction with this and allies. So the ally itself, if it has go again, it will trigger the trap, but because there's no attacking hero, the damage is not done, but the effect still carries over because it reads the next action card that hits. It doesn't specifically read the next attack action card controlled by the attacking hero hits. So you have to read very fine line between those things. With that said as well, the damage itself is preventable in specific cases. So there are equipments throughout the game, such as like the Seeker's suite of equipment and Oasis Respite and other things that can prevent damage. Those will prevent the 1 damage, but it cannot be blocked by a card blocking effect.
So because Riptide has access to so many different playstyles, it allows you to approach the deck in a multitude of ways. And it can change your approach pretty heavily depending on the meta. Aggro, for example, has a redline build that is basically, as it sounds, where it's primarily red cards. It uses a lot of 0-for-4s, some 1-cost arrows that have really relevant effects like Remorseless, and it limits its amount of total traps and defensive cards to the bare minimum so that it can get the best effects but have the least amount of spots dedicated to it, and it just goes go burr. While Tunic takes that and puts it a little bit further to the extreme, being able to utilize the Tunic counter to push damage even on a 1-card hand, and allows it to cut some of those defensive cards to go more aggro, but then it's more susceptible to disruption effects.
Whereas then you get into the other builds, so you have the hybrid build. This is more of a traditional mid-range build where you basically play hand by hand. Sometimes you'll have a hand of go wide, sometimes you'll have a hand of defense, and sometimes you'll have a hand of go tall. You basically just play out your best hand, do the math accordingly. And then you have the Boltide list, which plays more like Icelander, if anyone was around in that day where we had Bolander, where you basically want to defend with 2 cards and send a 2-card 6 or 7 if you can. So it's basically a straight value build. Then you have Fatigue. Fatigue is literally all about the value as well. You're trying to take more cards than you're giving and eventually wear your opponent down to where you're able to recoup some cards that keep coming back in play and able to survive long enough. Then we have the Aim build. This is one of the original ways it seemed Riptide was meant to be built, but only recently has it actually been viable. And this one is essentially jumping through hoops to get really cool on hits. So you have a lot of ways to navigate the certain cards and play with the abilities, with all of his equipment and the cards themselves, flipping all together to do some really cool stuff.
So there's a lot of different mindsets between each of the builds that kind of break off a little bit more on how you're trying to approach and how you're taking the mindset. So for aggro, you're trying to force blocks with raw numbers that punish no blocks. And with things like on hits on searing or frailty, laced with frailty, and stuff like that, you can extract extra value just for the fact that your card hit, which can make blocks awkward for the opponent. You are trying to get max value on both offense and defense. You're really trying to do a lot of that block 2 cards, send 7, similar to the Bullander, but you have a significant amount of extra on hits. You're trying to force your opponent to have 2 card hands because your 2 cards are typically better than most in the game. And you're trying to force your opponent to close to lethal range by... There's a term that's lethal by traps that you have like available to you in deck. You can usually look at it based off of what you have left. And your breakpoints and trap pings make the end game scary for most players. And the moment that you receive tempo, it becomes hard for them to win at that point.
So the hybrid mindset, they kind of play like an aggro guardian. They basically, again, they'll play like the best hand or best option in their hand. So if you end up drawing, let's say like a Ravenous Rabble with a Bolt and Shot, 1 buff, and a 0 for 4 arrow, then you're going to basically not block and try and send all of those. But let's say you draw 2 traps and 1 stronger arrow and a pitch, you can just block with the 2 traps, send the arrow. So you're basically just trying to minimize and maximize the hands best possible so that you get the best math out of it. Then you want to look and outvalue your opponent with a lot of blocks and on hits, forcing them to block certain things they have to, and then, forcing them to take more cards when they attack you when you trigger traps. Then, yeah, obviously, you're going to try and block with extra cards to send 7, so you load Dreadbore a lot in this match, in this build, so that you basically can get that +1 on your 6 power arrows to make them a breakpoint. That's going to be very awkward for them to block if they have no armor. The fatigue mindset's similar to hybrid, but they're more focused on the end game. So you want to do pitch stacking, you want to cycle your endless and salvage shots. These are arrows that will come back into play if they hit. So you want to keep these in your deck as much as possible or bring them back with your quiver and remembrance. And this is just a pure value game on offensive and defensive. You never want to let up. You want to basically take more cards than your opponent is taking from you, basically. Then the aim mindset. So the aim mindset is kind of like a true hybrid of the real fatigue and aggro, because it can balance between them based on builds, but you basically have a lot of disruption and a lot of evasion because you have a lot of dominate you can access to. You also have a lot of cards like Fletch the red tail and Fletch the yellow and blue. You basically can make them have more awkward blocks. You, again, play the pure value game, so you're just going to take more cards than you're giving to your opponent. You also want to play the tempo game plan, so you want to basically set up, so you'll run New Horizon to set up a face-up card. That way you can keep it there until you need it, while you're still cycling through the other arsenal slot with traps and arrows. And you want to just maximize the value with instant speeds as well, so you can basically avoid on-hits that cause you to discard when you can load your bow at instant speed, flip other cards at instant speed, and cause different cool shenanigans like that.
So why play Riptide? Well, he has many builds that allow him to have an extremely diverse gameplay and a massive amounts of build that he has access to. Due to this, it becomes really easy to have a expression of your playstyle. And also, as well, it allows you to make it a little bit difficult for your opponent to actually sideboard against you due to this diversity. Aside from him being really fun, I think a lot more people should actually give him a shot. PowerPoint that we just went over is going to be available in the description as a Google Drive doc, and there'll be a whole folder of all of them. Feel free to use that however you guys wish. It's just so that everyone has access to this information. Comment down below if we miss anything on these topics, and see you next time.